Okay, so this is the first lecture for EC4202 Government and Business. This is actually a subsequent recording of the lecture as the initial recording phase. We'll just start with topic 1 in the module, which looks at the goals of macroeconomic policy. So we'll run through some of the issues when looking at the macro side of the economy, what it is the government is trying to achieve. And we'll also look at some of the limits that are placed on the government in trying to set out and achieve those goals. So there's a list of readings that you can look at, some questions that will be related to the material, and here are the key goals, the objectives of macroeconomic policy. So one, the first objective is to increase the standard of living, to make people better off, to give them a better quality of life, to give them a better, as it says, standard of living. 2, to achieve a low rate of unemployment, which clearly is related to the first. And 3rd is to achieve both of the above and have a low rate of inflation, where inflation measures price changes. And some of the key price changes we'd be interested in are consumer prices, what people have to pay for the goods and services they purchase every day. So to achieve an increase in living standards, low rates of unemployment, and in a stable price environment, they'll be the key goals of macroeconomic policy. Some of the constraints which governments face in trying to achieve these objectives are first, long-run equilibrium in the public finances, the outturn of government revenue and government expenditure. But you can't be running deficits over a sustained period and building up debt and expect to be able to run the economy sustainably. And second is the long-run equilibrium in the balance of payments. The balance of payments is the record of transactions with the rest of the world. So the government accounts measure money flowing in and out of government. The balance of payments measures money flowing in and out of the country. So it's relating to exports, imports, income, flows of profits, flows of dividends, etc., flows of rents, all in and out of a country. So how much money is leaving the country and how much money is entering the country. So again, you're looking for a long run equilibrium in the balance of payments. So we'll work through these goals in more detail. So we'll start with increased living standards. So to measure increased living standards, we generally use a concept called gross domestic product, which simply measures the total value of all goods and services produced in the economy. So gross is a measure of total, domestic is in the economy, and product is output. So the total value of all goods and services produced in the economy in a given year. That's not 2008 data, that's 2010 data. So in 2010 in Ireland, GDP was just under 156 billion. So we produced 156 billion of goods and services, or just under 35,000 euro per person. So one of the highest levels of GDP in the world at 35,000 per person or per capita, 156 billion in aggregate. So it's an indicator of well-being of society. It's just one measure of well-being. It's not the complete or perfect measure. If you go to YouTube and look up Robert Fitzgerald Kennedy RFK on GDP, you'll get a fairly interesting little speech that RFK gave on the usefulness of GDP in measuring living standards, because it misses out on a whole host of things. It just counts the monetary value of goods and services produced in an economy. It doesn't take into account concepts such as society, the environment, air quality, quality of schools, quality of education, quality of health services. It just measures quantity. So it is a measure of well-being, but it's not a perfect or complete measure. There are a whole range of things it misses out. Voluntary organisations, community groups, impact of sport, impact of nationality, impact of a collective spirit, all which might be picked up as being part of a society. Some societies can have these factors in greater abundance than others. They might have the same GDP, but people might be happier in one society or the other. So that wouldn't be picked up in GDP. What GDP is useful for is tracking movement. While it mightn't be a perfect measure, if GDP tends to rise or fall, it does tend to reflect what's happening in the overall economy. So you might be able to use it in its absolute term as the number to be hugely important. We can use GDP, and particularly GDP changes, to track what's happening in the economy. And when we look at, as we will shortly, GDP growth rates, we see how this reflects the overall performance of the country. Other frequently used measures of living standards, and particularly the one in red, gross national product. GNDI is gross national disposable income, and then just national income. We were primarily concerned with gross national product. The big difference between gross domestic product and gross national product is that GNP is the value of goods and services that accrues to nationals or people living within the country. So gross domestic product is total output regardless of who does it. Gross national product is the income that accrues to residents of the country as a result of that output. So in most countries, GDP and GNP are largely the same. There isn't a huge difference between them, 1 or 2 percentage points. In Ireland, gross national product is 20% below gross domestic product. There is a substantial difference between the total value of output produced in Ireland and the total amount of income earned by residents of Ireland. The key impact here is, of course, the foreign companies, the foreign multinationals which operate in Ireland, and they repatriate their profits back to their home state. So whether it's Microsoft, Google, Facebook, etc., repatriating their profits to America, some of the large European companies who operate here, but in general most of the flow would be to America. So a substantial portion of the output that is produced in Ireland generates profits that are earned by those who live outside of Ireland. Now we do have benefits from the foreign multinationals accruing here. The wages they pay, the services they use, all form part of both GDP and GNP. So there are substantial benefits from having the foreign multinationals here. It's just that their profits are repatriated abroad. So if we look at some recent figures of gross domestic product in Ireland, so these are from the website of the CSO. So we can see gross product in total, so national income in total. So we can see that GDP peaked in 2007 at almost 190 billion, and since then it's been falling and fell most dramatically in 2009 and again fell in 2010. There are suggestions that into 2011 it is beginning to stabilise. So during 2008, 2009 fell quite rapidly. 2010 sort of flatlined, and the start of 2011 has seen a bit of an upswing. Now these figures are quarterly figures, are subject to revisions and are volatile, so we won't read too much into this. But it is the first signs of sustained over 2 quarters growth in Ireland that we've seen since 2006. The last time we had 2 quarters in a row. Whether this growth will actually continue or even stay in the data is hard to know, but at least it's a positive indication from the start of 2011. So GDP falling and falling quite dramatically. So you can see the peak here in 2007 and then the drop, and you can see the drop in 2009, dropped each and every quarter and dropped quite rapidly. 2008 at least there was 1 quarter where it stayed a bit, but it dropped quite dramatically. Then bottomed out a bit in 2010, maybe 2011 starting to pick up again. GNP, gross national product, and here you can see the gap between the two. The total value of output, total earnings, 190 billion, 163. We're now down to 156 and 128. So GNP has fallen as much as GDP, and gross national income is just a measure that accounts for transfers from abroad. So it could be EU aid, particularly to the agriculture sector in Ireland. That would be income in Ireland, but it wouldn't come from output produced in Ireland. So GNI would measure transfers from abroad, and you can see that GNI is slightly larger than GNP. That means we get transfers from abroad, that our contribution to the EU budget, our own foreign aid budget, and then what we receive back from the EU and other sources means that we're net recipients. Not a huge amount, but it does mean that GNI, gross national income, is slightly larger than GNP. Looking at it on per capita basis, again you can see the drop. So from nearly 44,000 in 2007 down to 35,000 now. National income for GNP from 38,000 to 29,000, so quite substantial drops. So these are gross product per capita. These aren't per worker. If this was per worker, it would be almost 2.5 times as many. We have a population of 4.5 million and 1.8 million workers. So these are per capita, for every person living in the state. So the levels of output in Ireland are very, very high, and put us still in the top 10 of the world, as measured by GDP in particular, per capita. So just looking at the recent graph, we can see the rises. The falls are in 2008, 2009, going nowhere really in 2010, and maybe some positive signs for early parts of 2011. But as I said, we'll wait to see what subsequent data releases give. The next quarterly national accounts will be released in the run up to Christmas, so 3 months from now. So it could be that this figure will be revised, it could be revised down, it could be revised up. And we'll also see then what the trend over a longer period of 2011 is. So you can see the figures can be quite volatile, with falls followed by rises. So it'll be interesting to see where this goes over subsequent months. Looking at Ireland compared to the EU average, going right back to the 1960s, we can see that compared to the EU average, we remain between 60 and 70% of the EU average. So GDP in Ireland was about 2/3 of that of the EU average. It was only in the late 1980s, particularly in the 1990s, that we began to converge on the EU average and surpassed the EU average in about 1996, and then continued to grow past the EU average up to 2005. But if this graph was extended, there would be a substantial deterioration in our comparison with the EU average. But you can see for large parts of economic history, development was pretty much close to zero. We didn't converge, as the growth theory suggests should happen, on the richer nations, but stayed below them until the late 1990s, and then began to grow and grow quite rapidly. So virtually no progress made until the 1980s. Since then our rise has been meteoric up to 2005, but we have fallen back then since 2007. When looking at the GDP, as we said, it does pick out or miss a whole host of factors. But one important element that GDP gives us is what's known as the business cycle, which is sort of the pattern of growth rates. An important element to consider here is how much of the change in GDP is due to prices and how much of the change in GDP is due to output. If it's due to price changes, it's not a real change. So if you make 1,000 bicycles at €100 a pop, your GDP is €10,000. So you just get the real output, the output 1,000, multiply it by the price 100, and you get €10,000. If the following year the price of bicycles has risen to €110, and you again make 1,000 bicycles, your nominal GDP is 11,000. So your nominal GDP has gone from 10,000 to 11,000. But in a sense, you're not producing anything extra. Although GDP has gone up, it has only gone up because of price changes. And if all prices have gone up by 10%, if the prices of food, clothing, going out, housing, services, if everything you use has gone up by 10%, well then you're in exactly the same position. There has been no growth. You're earning 10% more money, but in order to buy the same bundle of goods you bought last year, you must spend 10% more money. So the net effect is zero. So a nominal increase in GDP does not necessarily correspond to an improvement. It does not correspond to a real increase. In order for it to be a real increase, you must be making more stuff. Output must be expanding. It cannot simply be down to price changes. Price changes just reflect an element that's multiplied it, and if all prices are changing, you don't have a real change. So value is quantity by price. What we're concerned with the growth rate is the change in quantity. What is the real change? What is the change in the amount of goods and services being produced in the economy? So given nominal GDP, if we know the number, and some sort of price index, something that tells us what's happened to prices over the past 12 months, whatever it is, we can construct or derive real GDP. We can see how much of the increase or change in nominal GDP is actually due to changes in output, is due to real changes. is not simply as a result of changes in prices. So change in the real GDP is known as the real growth rate, and it's changes in the real growth rate that make up the business cycle. So you can have substantial changes in nominal GDP, but they can be due to inflation or deflation. There's no real impact unless quantity is changing. So you get the real GDP growth rate. So this is the real GDP growth rate in Ireland for the last 50 years of the 20th century. So from 1950 up to just beyond the year 2000. And you can see how the average growth rate differed by years. So you can see the 2 decades in which growth was particularly anemic. The 1950s with an average growth rate of 1.1%, and the 1980s with an average growth rate of 1.6%. So that's basically an economy going nowhere over a 10-year period. The 60s and 70s had fairly vibrant growth, but it really only is in the 1990s that growth went through the roof. So an average growth rate of 6.8% in the 1990s, which is a phenomenal rate of growth. And it's a growth rate we're unlikely to see re-emerge in the medium term. And you can see it peaking there at almost 11% in about 1998, 1999, which is a phenomenal rate of growth, only matched at the moment by the better bot that is China, but they are running foul of some of the similar problems we faced after we went through a period of sustained economic growth. So while the growth is good, it does lead to some concerns, particularly in the property market, the residential property market, that must be taken into account. So looking at the growth rate in Ireland, we can see there have been periods where the economy has contracted before. So it's not just in the recent cycle of the growth rates that GDP has been contracting. So in the 1950s there was 3 years, maybe even 4 years, where the economy contracted. In the 1980s we can see 3 years in quick succession where the economy went through a contraction. If we extended this graph, as we will shortly, up to 2009, 2010, we'll also see years where the growth rate was negative. And in fact the negative growth rates in the current recession are far greater than the growth rates here. If we just look quickly at the next graph, you'll see 8 and 9, so a 3 and a 4% drop in real GDP in those years. So that would be greater, this graph when it was down to -2. So both the most recent downturns would be more severe than what happened here. So we can see in the 1960s that we went through a period of fairly lively growth. In the 1960s the Irish economy had begun to open up, free second level education was introduced, and the Irish economy was moving away from the inward orientation that had dominated economic thinking right from the foundation of the state in the 1920s right the way up to the 1950s. That there was this concept of inward orientation or self-sufficiency, that whenever Irish people needed to provide for themselves, they would make themselves, that we'd shut ourselves off from the rest of the international economy. And there was a period where this was actually a successful policy. In the 1930s, global economies suffered as a result of the Great Depression, and to a certain extent the impact of the Great Depression were insulated from Ireland as a result of our inward orientation and self-sufficiency, and we would make things ourselves. But it did hinder and limit growth. We undertook activities that should never have been undertaken in the Irish economy. So we have the creation of steel plants, chemical plants, all of which were state owned, which weren't economically viable and which required state funding in order to make them some way operational. And then it was only in the last 20 years or so that much of this has been scaled back with either shutdowns or privatisation. Like, even the island of Ireland is far too small a scale to have a viable steel plant. Yet we built one in Cove in County Cork, a chemical plant, ICI, and we imposed substantial tariffs on the import of goods. Again, it was felt that this would offer support for Irish manufacturers, but did lead to some strange outcomes. So the import of cars had fairly substantial import levies applied in Ireland, whereas the import of car parts didn't. So if you imported a completed car, you'd have substantial levies. If you introduced parts which were ostensibly for the manufacturing process, they weren't subject to such levies. So in Ireland we had the unusual situation where Ford manufactured cars in Cork. So Ford were a huge employer in Cork, but didn't really manufacture cars. The cars were actually manufactured over in Birmingham in the UK. What happened over there was when they were importing them to Ireland, they took them apart. They made the car, had all the parts, and took them apart. So most of the work was done over there. And then what happened in Ireland was they just put them back together again. So whatever parts were taken separately from the UK were put together in Ireland. And this was as a result of our import quotas. The tariffs imposed on the importing of manufactured cars made it worthwhile to undertake this completely uneconomic activity. And then as soon as the tariffs were eliminated and we opened up our economy, we just imported whole cars. And the Ford's plant did shut down. And initially it did have severe consequences because of the loss of jobs. But over time cars became cheaper and the economy then integrated those workers into other areas. So change does have significant upheavals, particularly for those who lose their jobs, but in the long run it can have benefits. So in the 1960s we began opening up our economy slowly but surely away from the inward orientation, self-sufficiency that was introduced in the 1920s, that had largely seen no economic development from 1920 to 1950. Living standards were largely the same over that 30 or 40 year period. In the 1970s then we began to explore economic policy, particularly the policies proposed by John Maynard Keynes back in the 1930s. Keynes, who wrote the General Theory of Money, Employment and Interest as a solution to the Great Depression, what should happen. And Keynes had a very strong advocacy that the government must do something. So his view was that in the long run we are all dead, we can't wait for the economy to right itself. The government must step in, so that if there's a shortfall of demand, the government should spend money to stimulate the economy, pump prime the economy, to keep demand at a certain level, to keep the economy going. So up to 1970, 1971, the objective of the Irish Minister for Finance had been to run a balanced current budget. So whatever money the government collected in tax should have been equal to whatever the money the government spent on goods and services. So the objective each year was a balanced budget. The budget wasn't seen as a policy instrument, something to be used to achieve macroeconomic policies. The budget was seen as a policy objective, that it in itself, achieving a balanced budget, was one of the goals of macroeconomic policy. Well, beginning in the 1970s, we began to see that it may be possible to use the current account, government spending, to stimulate the economy. And this had been sort of experimented with early in the 1970s, but it came to the fore in 1973 with the first oil price shock. So the Irish had discovered Keynes, the Sheikhs had discovered elasticity. So the price of oil more than quadrupled in quite a short period of time, and this increase in the price of oil led to a global downturn. So oil is a very demand inelastic good. People are going to have to purchase it whether the price is high or low. So the price then shot up, and the more money that had to be spent on oil, particularly imported oil from the Middle East, the less money was available for everything else. So there was a substantial transfer of funds to the Middle East and a slowdown in the global economy. So the Irish response was, well, we aren't experimenting with Keynes. What should we do in the midst of a downturn? We should cut taxes and increase expenditure. So by cutting taxes, you're letting people themselves have more money, and by increasing expenditure, the government is putting more money out into the economy. And this seemed to have the desired effect. So if you look at the growth in 73, 74, quite low, and then began to shoot up in 75, 76. And this is exactly as the Keynesian orthodoxy would suggest. And the government had undertook the correct action for the economy as it was at that time. However, in 1977 we had a clash of cycles. We had a clash of the business cycle, which was reaching a peak, and a clash of the political cycle, which was approaching an election. So the economy had turned around, growth was quite high, unemployment was falling, And there was a feeling that getting into power was quite a good thing to have. So the 1977 general election tended to be a giveaway election where all sides promised huge tax cuts and expenditure increases for the public on the basis of trying to get into power. And this now is the complete opposite of what the Keynesian orthodoxy suggests. So Keynes suggests when the economy is performing poorly, the government should step in and pump the money into the economy, so that then when the economy performs well again, the government should be able to pay back down the debts it built up during the bad times, pay them back with the surpluses of the good times. But rather than doing that, we continued to further cut taxes. So 1977 saw the abolition of domestic rates, so charges on households for the services provided by local government. These were abolished in 1977, and the funding of local government was assumed by central government. So it was going to come from taxes, and tax rates were already falling. Also in 1977 saw the introduction of an additional 10,000 civil servants. Huge creation of employment, huge stimulus of demand in the economy. So the immediate reaction after the election was to cut taxes and increase expenditure. However, in 1979 there was a second oil price shock. The global economy further dipped into recession again, and this dragged the Irish economy back into recession as we had opened ourselves up over the preceding 20 years. So the reaction in 1973-74 had been to cut taxes and increase expenditure. And this, in a sense, had dragged us out of the recession of the early 1970s. However, once we got into 1979-1980, the scope for cutting taxes and increasing expenditure had all but been eliminated. In fact, taxes were now too low, and expenditure was too high, and a huge public deficit opened up. The scope to use the budget as a policy instrument had been eliminated. The budget deficit once again became a target. We had to achieve sustainability in the public finances. And unlike 1977, when everybody went again into power, by 1981-82 nobody wanted to be in power. In fact, we had 3 general elections over an 18-month period. Governments were falling on quite small things. So famously, one Fine Gael Labour coalition fell because of Minister for Finance at the time, John Bruton, tried to introduce VAT for children's shoes. So children's shoes are VAT exempt. John Bruton tried to introduce VAT on children's shoes, and the budget was defeated, particularly on the vote of Limerick independent Jim Kemmy. And one constitutional fact in Ireland is that if the government loses what's called a money vote, the government and the Dáil must immediately be dissolved. So on losing that budget, it led to a general election. The argument John Bruton made was that some women have small feet, and therefore were able to avoid paying VAT by buying children's shoes. And on that, a government fell. By 1983, Gareth Fitzgerald had returned as Taoiseach, this time with Alan Dukes as Minister for Finance. And while there was a realisation that something needed to be done, there actually was very little done. But it was a stable government, and did stay in power from 83 to 86. But as you can see, this is a period where the recession of the 1980s hit its depths. So while there was changes, they didn't really address the key issue, and most of the changes introduced focus on increasing taxes, but these didn't have the desired effect as the black economy flourished. So tax rates went up near 60% for income tax. So the top rate of tax now is 41%, plus a few levies, might get maybe to 46 or 47%. Back in the 1980s, income tax alone was 58%. So add PRSI and other taxes to that, and you can see why the incentives for tax evasion would be quite strong. So then in 1987 we had another election, and Fianna Fáil with Charlie Haughey as Taoiseach and Ray McSharry as Minister of Finance got into power. So they were a minority government. But in the run up to the election there was what was referred to as the Tallaght strategy, where all the parties in the Dáil agreed that certain steps had to be taken to get the budget deficit under control, that the sustainability and viability of the state was at question, and much like now, our debt levels were soaring up towards 120% of GDP, and 30% of tax revenue was going on paying the interest on the national debt. And the national debt and the deficit became the objective, rather than unemployment, inflation, living standards. That it simply was a matter of getting the budget deficit under control. So Ray McSharry adopted a different approach to Alan Dukes, and he went and cut expenditure severely. He became known as Mac the Knife. So cuts were introduced across the largest areas of government, education, social welfare, health. Dramatic cuts were brought about. It wasn't so much that they brought the deficit under control, more that they actually sent a signal that there was a willingness to bring the deficit under control. And by 88, 89, growth began to return to the economy. It is a bit of a contradiction in terms that as the government is cutting expenditure from the economy, as the government is reducing demand, that overall or aggregate demand in the economy increased. And in fact, the term used to describe this phase of Irish economic history is contractionary fiscal expansion. So we have the words contraction and expansion used in the same context for Ireland. So the common belief has emerged that it wasn't so much bringing the deficit under control that led to the growth, more the belief that the deficit would be brought under control that led to an increase in household spending, an increase in confidence, an increase in investment, albeit slow at the start. But people began to re-emerge from the doldrums in the 1980s with the belief that the economy could survive, whereas in the 1980s there was a huge lack of confidence with the very viability of the state under question. By the late 1980s, there was a certain view that these things have to be done, they will be done, and if they are done, we can survive. So the growth peaked in the late 1980s, again up towards 7 or 8%. There was a bit of a dip following the European currency crisis in the early 1990s. As the euro lurched towards a single currency, there was an exchange rate mechanism which certain traders took huge advantage of as European countries tried to defend their currencies within the bands set out in the exchange rate mechanism, and we ourselves had to devalue, in early 1992, as the value placed on the Irish punt at the time was too high in the ERM. Britain tried to defend sterling and used up huge resources buying sterling when all the short sellers were selling it and knowing it would fall in value, and they too had to leave the ERM and sterling fell in value. So Britain had purchased huge amounts of sterling at overly inflated prices, and as soon as the adjustment took place, they lost hugely, and some speculators earned billions. George Soros in particular earned billions from Nigel Lawson, the Chancellor of the Exchequer at the time, the father of Nigella Lawson. And in Ireland it was Bertie Ahern who was at Taoiseach and declared on a Friday that we wouldn't devalue, but by the time markets opened at 8 o'clock on Monday, we'd relented and did devalue. And this sort of had medium-term consequences for the growth rates in Europe and other economies. But from most perspectives, it was just a short-run thing. What happened then in the 1990s was that the euro loomed large, the Maastricht Treaty was passed, and the criteria for entry into the single currency were agreed. And these were a budget deficit of less than 3%, a national debt of less than 60%, both of GDP, and interest rates and inflation comparable to that of the Eurozone average. So these now became the objectives. And the deficit in Ireland was still quite high. Our national debt was over 120% of GDP. Our interest rates in the run-up to the devaluation were 14 and 15%. And inflation, as we'll see, was also running quite high. So we missed most of the main targets set out in the Maastricht criteria, and they became the objectives over the next couple of years. But they were sort of hit in spite rather than as a result of economic policy. So if you look at growth in the late 1990s, it simply took off. This was Celtic Tiger Phase 1. Export-led, output-led, manufacturing-led growth in the Irish economy with growth rates of 7, 8, 9, 10% per annum. Phenomenal growth over a sustained period. These growth rates saw the reduction in the budget deficit. These growth rates saw the national debt as a percentage of GDP fall from over 100% to close to 30%. And these growth rates were also achieved with astonishingly low rates of inflation. There was huge surplus and capacity in the Irish economy. We had unemployment of 17, 18%. So during this period of huge growth, there was very little wage demand. And in fact, we had national wage agreements, the principle of which was to control wage demands of employees, and reductions in tax were offered to offset the lower increases in wages that were set out through the national wage agreements. So it was achieved through low inflation. So this was the first Celtic Tiger. If we look then at the growth rate for a more recent period, so we can see Celtic Tiger phase 1, we can see then the growth rate slowed and slowed substantially in 2001, 2002, particularly after the terrorist attacks in the Twin Towers in New York. On September 11, 2001, these led to questions about the viability of the global economy, global markets, and the integration that was taking place. So there was a slowdown. But this quickly passed in Ireland, primarily because we'd entered the euro and we now had access to credit at interest rates heretofore unseen in Ireland. Interest rates were below the inflation rate in Ireland, so the real interest rate in Ireland was negative. You could borrow money, and in real terms you could expect to pay back less. So borrow 10, 100, 200,000 euro, and by 3-4 years time your income or the value of the asset would have changed, and you'd end up paying back less and have a substantial profit. Or so the theory went. So from about 2003 onwards, Celtic Tiger phase 2 began. And this was the credit-fueled, consumption-driven, construction-driven phase of the Celtic Tiger, where much of the increase in output wasn't because of exports, manufacturing, was because of construction and house building. And in 2007, house building peaked at 90,000 units. England has 15 times the population of Ireland, but they were only building twice as many houses as we were. We were building half as many houses as they were for 1/15 the population. So clearly it was unsustainable. But with low interest rates and a booming economy, it lasted for a period of 4 to 5 years. And at the end it sort of finished up with immigrants from Eastern Europe coming to Ireland to build houses that they themselves were going to have to live in. And when the burst came, it came quite dramatically. And the peak arrived in 2007, and the economy then contracted significantly in 2008, 2009, a bit of stabilisation in 2010, and it's unknown as to where the economy will go in 2011. But the signs thus far are reasonably positive. So we can use the business cycle to track living standards. And you can see like when the worst times were the 1950s, the 1980s, and you can also see that the current time would have tumultuous impact on living standards. So GDP does give us an indication of the direction. Again, it can be quite hard to make actual comparisons because all that's left out of GDP, but in itself is useful, the real GDP growth rate, to measure the overall performance of the economy. The last element we'll just briefly look at before finishing this class is unemployment. So it's the second objective, a low rate of unemployment, and clearly giving people employment, giving people jobs, giving them the means to earn an income is one of the best ways you can improve their living standards. If you have more money, you can purchase more goods and services, and in general that will lead to a higher living standards. So unemployment is sort of tied in with objective 1. So somebody is unemployed if they are looking for work and willing to do a job at the going wage rate for the type of work he or she is qualified to do. So if somebody's qualified for a particular job and people in that job earn 40,000 a year, and this person is looking for 140,000 a year, well, clearly they're not unemployed. They're not willing to work at the going wage rate. They're looking for a completely unreasonable wage rate. So you're unemployed if you're looking for work and willing to do it at the going wage rate. So in Ireland we have a labour force which is measured again by the Central Statistics Office, but in this instance it's measured by a survey. We'll come back to the problems of this again. So the CSO undertake the quarterly National Household Survey, where they interview about 20,000 people, just over 20,000 people, and ask them a whole range of questions. One of the most important things to come from this is their labour force status. Are you in the labour force? Are you retired? Are you in education? Are you working at home? If you're in the labour force, do you have a job? Are you unemployed? Are you looking for a job? And whole host of other questions asked. So this gives us the unemployment rate. So the most recent quarterly national household survey was released just over a week ago, and this gives us data to the end of June 2011. And this shows a labour force of just over 2.1 million people, of which 1.8 million people were at work, and just over 300,000 people were classed as unemployed. So this might run counter to some common refrains on Irish unemployed, with upwards of 450, 470, and some claims of 500,000 unemployed. They're largely based on the live register. The live register is a register of those in receipt of social welfare payments. And these may not necessarily be unemployment or unemployed. Many of those in receipt of labour benefits from social welfare actually have a job. It's just that their income is below certain thresholds that entitles them to certain payments. Other people may not be even looking for a job, may not be able to work, or might not be willing to work. Again, they wouldn't be counted as unemployed. So the official number of unemployed in Ireland is 304,500. Again, this is based on survey data of 20,000 people. One reason why we might have concerns about the accuracy of this figure at the moment is because of the preliminary census results that were released about 2 months after the census last April. So in the run-up to the census, the CSO believed that the population of Ireland was 4.45 million. And then, using their survey data from the Quarterly National Household Survey, they were able to aggregate up to a population estimate of 4.45 million. So that's where their estimate of the labour force came from, their estimate of the employment and unemployment came from. But what emerged with the preliminary census results is that the population was actually 100,000 larger than they thought. And the population is 4.55 million. So from the last census in 2006, the CSO had been estimating population. So clearly they can get data on births. Births are registered. They can get data on deaths. Deaths are registered. And then they had their own estimates of migration. The numbers of people entering and leaving the country from passenger number data at the airports and ferry ports, etc. But it turned out that their estimate was out by 100,000. So they have 100,000 more people to add back into these figures. So the labour force might be higher in Ireland, the number employed could be higher, and maybe most worryingly, the number unemployed could be quite higher. One thing that's unlikely to change is the unemployment rate, because the unemployment rate is a division. It's made up of the number unemployed divided by the labour force. When the CSO add in the extra 100,000, they'll be adding in both above the line and below the line. So the net effect on the unemployment rate will perhaps be quite small, because people will be added both above and below the line. So using the most recent QNHS, and the CSO uses the live register as a gauge of changes, the current unemployment rate in Ireland is 14.4%. So this is up substantially what it was 10 years ago, but still is below where it was back in the 1980s. But 14.4% is a horrendous rate of unemployment. But it'll only be over the next 12 to 18 months, and perhaps maybe this time next year, when the CSO revise their figures based on the full census results, when they know who these extra 100,000 people are. Which age categories have they been getting wrong? Which nationalities have they been getting wrong? Which regions have they been getting wrong? And which labour force status have they been getting wrong? So all these data are in the census, but thus far they have just taken account, asked each census enumerator how many people were in the couple of hundred forms that you had filled out, and just added those numbers. What they need to do is scan all the individual census forms to get detailed data on all the individuals in the state, and these figures will then be updated. But the unemployment rate is unlikely to be updated. So we'll leave it at that for our first class, and we'll take it up from there next Thursday. Thanks very much.